Last week's sermon focused a lot on many of the fraudulent things that various people have used trying to prove that Darwinism is the proven theory of where humanity came from. The textbooks have been filled with a lot of literal propaganda that started showing up in the books during the 50s. There was a push to add more Darwinistic teachings to our society in response to the Russians beating us in the space race. During the 50s, the amount of Darwinism being taught in the schools increased exponentially. Before that time, most people generally believed in the Bible's creation story. But interestingly enough, after the 50s, when Darwinism started getting taught, and going into the 60s, especially after 1963 when the Supreme Court removed the Bible and prayer from the schools, that's when we see all kinds of moral standards start to plummet. Think of it like the difference between Leave It to Beaver and Andy Griffith being super conservative and highly moral to all the sex and murder all over the TV today. That kind of gradual decrease in moral standards started plummeting quickly right after Darwinism started getting taught in schools and the Bible was removed from them. Gee, what a coincidence, right? Wrong. When you teach children that they're just evolved animals and that the Bible's just a myth and not important, then they'll start acting like animals with nobody that they'd have to answer to. The common belief in Darwinism is very poisonous to our society. Let me talk about Charles Darwin for a bit first. He wasn't a scientist. He was training to be a preacher. But something happened to him early on in his adulthood. He read a book. He read a book that someone wrote that tricked him into believing a lot of false stuff about geology and how old everything is. That book was called Principles of Geology by a guy named Charles Lyell, a guy who hated the Bible and did everything he could to ridicule it. After reading that book, Charles Darwin traded in his desire to be a preacher for a new desire to explain where we came from instead of the Bible. He studied how big the beaks were of finches, the birds that he found on the Galapagos Islands, and decided that because some of them had bigger beaks, that meant they were changing or evolving. But what he did wrong was he saw a very tiny change and extrapolated it into supposed huge changes over millions of years, without any actual evidence of the big changes. Darwin himself said that if his theory was true, we would find a whole bunch of transitional fossils. We've found none in the over 150 years since his book came out. He also said it was pretty unbelievable that the human eye could evolve, but he thought it must have happened anyway. He was deceived by fake science, and then created more of his own fake science that has gone on to deceive the whole world. And over the last 150 plus years since his book, plenty of people who call themselves scientists have searched and searched for the evidence of Darwin's theory. And you'd be amazed at how many of them actually admit that there's really no evidence for it. They know there are no transitional fossils. They know they can't watch macroevolution actually happen empirically. They know the whole thing is a different kind of science called historical science, which is basically just guesswork, instead of empirical science, which is actual controlled experimentation producing measurable results. So now I'd like to discuss some more of the evidence that they use for Darwinism that's not outright fraud, like in my last sermon, but instead it's just them grasping at straws, trying to see Darwinism where it really isn't. They look at data and then interpret it in a way that supports what they want to believe. I said in the last video, and I'll say it again now, all the supposed evidence for Darwinism is either outright fraud or just bad interpretations of the actual data. Let's talk about the famous diagrams they use to show animals supposedly changing from one kind to another, like the cavemen. They draw an ape-like being, then something next to it that's a little more upright, then another one next to that one that's even more upright and less ape-like, and then finally a normal-looking human. But what they don't tell you is that they don't have the actual evidence for these diagrams. They're just drawings. The two intermediate beings in between the ape-like being and the human don't exist. They never did. I told you last time about how all the supposed cavemen were all frauds, and none of them actually existed. In real science, we see apes and we see humans. There has never been anything in between found anywhere. But that's not just true with humans. The same goes with all animals. I could go down a very long list of animals and ask the same thing. What evolved into the giraffe? There has never been anything found that comes even close to being halfway giraffe and halfway something else. How about the elephant? How about the penguin? How about the platypus? That one's a real stumper for the Darwinists. It's a mammal, but it lays eggs. It has a bill like a duck and webbed feet, but also has fur. Just remember, every single evolutionary diagram out there is just a drawing of what they wish was true. Another very common thing they claim is evidence for Darwinism is that animals often have similar features. They call them homologous structures, as if the big word makes it sound more scientific. But really, all they're saying is that because various kinds of animals have two arms that all have similar bones, such as the radius and ulna, that means they must have all evolved from the same original animal that had two arms. But is that really proof, or is it just conjecture? Isn't there another possibility? If the Bible is true, then God created all those animals. Wouldn't it make sense that he used a similar design with all the animals because that design just plain works? The Darwinists claim that homologous structures prove evolution is just not true. They're just interpreting the data the way they want to. And how about that famous phrase, the famous phrases, natural selection and survival of the fittest? Darwinists claim that natural selection is the driving force of macroevolution. But think about it. The concept of natural selection means that the strong survive while the weak die. That actually has nothing at all to do with macroevolution. The animals aren't growing new body parts in order to survive. Instead, how it really works is that an animal has some kind of genetic mutation which ends up being a deformity, not a benefit. That mutation ends up making it weaker, not stronger. How does an animal with half a wing or half an eyeball survive? There is no such thing as a beneficial mutation, especially not billions of them all making animals better and better. Look around. Animals with mutations are the runts of the pack. They're the first ones the wolf is gonna catch. That is what natural selection really is. It's very real, but it has nothing to do with macroevolution. All right, another claim they make is that bacteria or a bug become resistant to antibiotics or a pesticide, and that means they are evolving. This is just not true. This is how it really works. When an antibiotic or pesticide is used, it doesn't kill everything. It only kills most of them. The ones that were already resistant are the only ones to survive. Then those survivors reproduce. And now all of them are resistant. Nothing changed here. There was no macroevolution going on. You just killed all the weak ones, and now only the strong ones survive. They're still bacteria. They didn't change into something else. They're still cockroaches. They didn't become a different kind of bug. The resistance argument is again just another bad interpretation by the Darwinists. Here's the thing that's deceptive about evolution. We do see animals change. We see Great Danes and Chihuahuas, but they're still dogs. We see the African elephant and the Asian elephant, but they're still elephants. We see a whole bunch of different kinds of birds, but we never see one kind giving birth to a new kind. All we ever see is what's called microevolution, or sometimes they'll call it divergent evolution, small changes or variations within one kind of animal. Darwinists can claim all they want that they've seen bacteria or fruit flies or whatever else change species, but it's still a bacteria or a fruit fly. There can be more than one species within one kind of animal. It's not macroevolution. It's still only microevolution. That's all that's ever been observed. And that's real science, empirical science. Let me end now with a couple of cool things that, instead of knocking down Darwinism, these actually help prove biblical creation. Why do we have wisdom teeth? If you read the beginning of the Bible, you'll see that people back then used to live a lot longer than we do today. I'll be explaining why that was later on in this series, but that's where wisdom teeth fit in. Because of their diets back then and their longer lifespans, they grew additional teeth later in life as their skulls grew bigger. Better yet, there's something called mitochondrial DNA. That actually proves that all of humanity originates back to one single woman. They even traced it back to only several thousand years ago. That's exactly what the Bible teaches. But us Christians know her name, and even her husband's name, Adam and Eve. We even know a few of their kids' names, Abel, Cain, and Seth. Real science proves the Bible is literally true, people. Fake science tricks people into thinking we're just immoral animals. Next week, I'll start getting into fossils and geology and how they all disprove Darwinism and prove Noah's flood really happened. God bless you all.